I'm also the convener of something called the Middle East Studies Forum, which is an interdisciplinary research network at Deakin, which looks at, from an interdisciplinary perspective, all kinds of different issues going on in the Middle East. Tonight, or this afternoon, this Middle East Studies Forum has decided to convene this event for really one purpose alone, and that is because of the rapidly changing events that have occurred in Iraq over the last 10 days or so. And I'm sure all of you have been following these events to some degree with increasing horror, given some of the things that have occurred. I just want to give a very brief summary, and then we'll go into more of the question and answer style stuff, because today is really about engaging in a big discussion about what's going on and thinking through all of the different issues that what's going on in Iraq could mean. So none of us are really going to sort of speak for a very long time. We're going to speak for sort of 5 to 10 minutes each, and then we will open it up for question and answers beyond that. So what has happened? Well, I'm just going to summarise very briefly. What we've seen in about 10 days or so is the rapid expansion of a fundamentalist Islamic terrorist network called ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which is how we're going to refer to it, I think, tonight. The fall of key cities in Iraq, such as Mosul and Tikrit and several other cities in rapid succession. Also, and I think this is a very important dimension of what's happened in the last 10 days or so, but the similarly rapid expansion of Kurdish territories, and the Kurds taking key cities like Kirkuk, and also expanding into what is known as parts of the disputed territories in Iraq, which is another significant development in all of this. And also, of course, something that we are all naturally concerned about is the humanitarian issue, the massive killings and deaths that are going on, the massive exodus of at least 500,000 people out of Mosul and other areas of Iraq. And by all accounts, the real possibility at this point of a massive bloodbath in Iraq coming in the next few weeks and months, and potentially so it's a shame in a way to meet with your friends and colleagues in such inauspicious circumstances, and circumstances that we're here to discuss and to go through tonight, and the consequences of all of this. I'm very fortunate to be joined by my 3 esteemed colleagues tonight, and I'll just introduce them very briefly to you. I'm going to speak first, and then I'll be followed by Dr. James Barry, who is Associate Research Fellow at Deakin University, and he is an expert on Iran, on Iranian foreign policy, and also on religious minorities in the Middle East. So he will have some very interesting things to say about the consequences of all of this and potentially Iran's role. The third speaker then would be Dr. David Tittensall, who is a UNESCO Research Fellow at Deakin University. He's an expert on Turkish politics. He's just written an excellent book on the Gulen movement in Turkey. Has a very strong interest in Islamist movements in the Middle East and across the region, and I'm sure he will have a lot of insights into sort of Turkey's role in all of this and what all of this means for them as well. And finally, a man who probably needs no introduction to most of us here, Professor Shahram Akhbarzadeh, who is an expert, a world-renowned expert, really in all things to do with Middle East politics. And I'm hoping he will shed, or I'm sure he will shed a lot of light, not only on the broader questions for the region, but also one of his real expertise is also in US foreign policy. One of his many expertise is in US foreign policy, and US foreign policy in particular in relationship to the Middle East. So it's going to be a really exciting opportunity for us to discuss everything that's happening in Iraq right now from several different angles. And I think, and I hope that these different angles shed quite a bit of light on not only what we've seen, in the last 10 days or so, but what this could mean for the region and for the world and for Iraq moving forward. But before I hand over to my colleagues here and they offer their words of wisdom about everything that's occurring, I wanted to say a few words in order to give some context and some background to what has been happening in Iraq. I have to say I'm in a remarkably difficult situation. I've been studying Iraq for more than 10 years now and have done a lot of work on it in all different types of capacities and have a number of different interests in Iraq. And I've only been given 5 to 10 minutes when I really could take 5 to 10 days, I think, to probably go through a lot of the sort of historical material that needs to be dealt with, a lot of the grievances that are now coming to the surface in Iraq, a lot of the different factions, and what they represent and why Iraq has descended so rapidly into its current situation. So how does one condense, as I say, more than a decade of interest in this topic and potentially 5 to 10 days worth of talking into only 5 to 10 minutes? Quite a challenge. I think what I'm going to do is say that there are a lot of questions, and those questions are perhaps the things that we can all discuss together as we break into a kind of question and answer at the end of all of this. Some of the biggest questions, I think, and these are some of the things that I think the world needs to be thinking about and that we need urgent attention to, are things like, and this is a very big question, is what we've seen in the last 10 days the end of Iraq as we know it? Is it potentially the end of the modern nation state of Iraq? And this is a question we probably can't answer, but we should begin to investigate. I think it's a very big one. And if it is, what does that mean for the rest of the Middle East? What does that mean for the borders between different countries? We've seen, for example, ISIS have destroyed parts of the border between Iraq and Syria, and their campaign is very much to restore an Islamic caliphate that doesn't respect the borders that were imposed by the British and the French at the end of the Ottoman period, at the end of the First World War. So is this, and I'm not saying it is, but is this the end of Iraq as we know it? And is this the end of those borders, the end of the borders that divide the Middle East? And what would the new Middle East look like? How would we understand and engage with and deal with the Middle East that moves beyond those borders that have been in place for nearly a century now? Another big question, again, that I don't think I can answer in a few minutes, and I'm not sure we'll be able to answer collectively tonight, but that needs urgent attention and that needs our interest, I think, is who is to blame for all of this? And this has been, of course, a rousing debate in Congress in the US over the last 10 days or so, with Republicans blaming Democrats and Democrats blaming Republicans. Was it Obama's fault or was it Bush's fault, and so on and so on. But there are also bigger questions. To what extent should we be allocating blame to the Maliki government and to their failings to engage the Sunni population in Iraq? To what extent should we be blaming regional powers in the Middle East who back groups like ISIS covertly and other militias across the region? And to what extent do we, as Australians, having played a role in the coalition of the realm, to what extent do we shoulder some of the blame? And what ought to what mistakes did we make? And ought we have to be there in the first place? That's not the right grammar, but anyway, should we have ever gone? And given that we did, what should we be doing now? How can we deal with what's going on in Iraq now? And this brings, I guess, a bigger question is that, and this is the question, right, the burning question on Obama's desk today is what should he do? What should the international community do? What should the US do? We've seen, of course, that the Iraq foreign minister has formally requested that the US provide air support and airstrikes. General Petraeus has come out saying that that's absolutely not a good idea, but this is the big question. What should the US do? What ought the US do? What is the best option moving forward? And what should the international community do? What role might the UN have, and what role might Australia have moving forward into such a complicated scenario like that unfolding in Iraq right now? So there's some of the questions. Unfortunately, as I said, in 5 to 10 minutes I really can't answer any of those for you or even begin to hazard some kinds of conclusions or ideas, but hopefully we can revisit all of those questions in the discussion, and by doing so engage in a robust debate about what all of this means for Iraq and for the future of the region and the world. But there is one question that I just would like to deal with quickly. I don't have a lot of time, but there is one question that I would like to address because I think it underpins what we're going to talk about, and I think it's important in giving some context and background to what it is that we're going to discuss. And that question is sort of a pretty banal one, but it's one that needs to be understood if our discussion is to be fruitful. And that is, who is ISIS? A journalist I spoke to at about 6 a.m. this morning, bleary-eyed, waking up over the phone on radio, said to me, I hadn't heard of ISIS only a week ago. And I don't think he'd be alone in saying that ISIS, for many people, have completely come out of nowhere and been able to wage such a dramatic and expansive campaign that we ought to understand a little bit about them. So I've been saying in various media interviews and so on, I've been referring to ISIS as the evil and rebellious stepson of Osama bin Laden. And to a very real extent, that's what we're talking about. You know you're bad when Al-Qaeda disown you. You have to be that ideologically extreme and that physically extreme in what you do and what you want to impose that the mainline group of everything we know about Al-Qaeda and everything they've done decide that you can no longer fit in with their campaign and what they're doing. So that, I think, even just that speaks volumes about who ISIS are and what we ought to be fearing in terms of where they're coming from. It's important to establish the history of all of this, and you know, I'm a political scientist, but I'm also a little bit of a historian, and therefore I could bang on for hours and hours about where all of this comes from. But there's absolutely no way that we couldn't make an argument, or that we couldn't say that ISIS is a direct product of the US intervention of 2003. We went into Iraq and we were told by Bush, we were told by John Howard, we were told by Tony Blair that we were going there to defeat Al-Qaeda. Remember that? And because Saddam had links to Al-Qaeda and weapons of mass destruction. Of course, it was only a matter of weeks later that we found out that, of course, there were no weapons of mass destruction and there were no links to Al-Qaeda. This is a really important point, that there was no Al-Qaeda presence in Iraq prior to 2003. There were no fundamentalist Islamic terrorist networks in Iraq prior to 2003, but there certainly are now. And that has to be one of the legacies and one of the ways we engage with what happened after 2003. 2003 and everything that happened from there really brought a group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq to the fore. I won't go into all of the details of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. What I will say is that after the troop surge of 2007 and what's also routinely called the Arab Awakening, in which Sunni tribes fought against Al-Qaeda, the world and the US in particular trumpeted the notion that they had successfully defeated Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And there was a very triumphant heap of stuff that came out at this point. Of course, in retrospect, we know that they had not done that, but in fact, Al-Qaeda in Iraq lay low, they regrouped, they rearmed, they retrained, they planted sleeper cells right across the region, which is no issue. But two critical things that I want to point to that have led to today that I think also need to be understood are very important to the context of all of this. And both of these things happened in 2011, and they're really important turning points. In fact, historians, I think historians will look back at these two moments in 2011 and see that they were the catalyst of everything we're doing now. What happened in 2011? The first thing was the Arab Spring. Obviously, the Arab Spring is a big amorphous thing and it's still ongoing. There's all kinds of different questions around that. But the way that the Arab Spring played out in Syria and the way that within a matter of months it descended into a civil war in that country gave this group, what was Al-Qaeda in Iraq and what is now ISIS, an opportunity to spread their ideological campaign well beyond the borders of what they initially imagined. They had a whole new frontier. Syria is, of course, a Sunni majority state. People were widely disenfranchised by the Alawite slash Shia Assad regime, and ISIS, what has become ISIS, saw that they had an opportunity there. The other thing that happens in 2011 that is hugely significant for all of this is the complete withdrawal of all US troops from Iraq by the end of 2011. So suddenly a group that had been laying low, had been regrouping and rearming and retraining, had an opportunity to wage their campaign across two borders. Something that only a few years before they would not have even conceived of doing. This was not part of their idea, this was not part of their agenda. But suddenly they had this whole new opportunity to really fight on two fronts, to capitalise on Sunni resentment towards, in Iraq, the Shia-dominated government, and in Syria, the Alawite Assad regime. And the sort of lawlessness that was occurring in Sunni areas, the sort of lack of control by the central government, meant that they were able to fill that security void and undertake a program on a dramatic scale. So I'm not going to go through, and then I think, so therefore I'd like to say that 2011 was a dramatic year. It dramatically changed the potential of what they were able to do, and we're now seeing the ramifications of all of that. What I'm not going to do is catalogue every single accomplishment or military victory of ISIS, because the list is far too long and far too complicated. But I will say that from about March 2013, they started to really capture significant territory in Syria, including the strategic city of Raqqa, which you may or may not be able to see on there. I might actually just show you this map, because this is maybe just a little bit clearer. This mouse. It's one of those mouses that move very fast. Is that it? Okay. So here, you can see that from about middle of March 2013 onwards, they start to capture very significant territory in Syria. And then January 2014, in December 2013, it was about the 2-year anniversary of really deep, protracted Sunni protests across Anbar and several other parts of Iraq. And ISIS, again, were able to capitalise on this situation and were able to take control of two very important cities, Ramadi and Fallujah, which you can see getting very close to Baghdad and taking this part of Iraq. And from there, of course, they're able to dramatically expand, and we've seen the events of the last couple of weeks, where they're able to very rapidly expand from there to attack Samarra, and then the even more ambitious attack on Mosul, and of course other cities like Tikrit, and so on and so on and so on. So you can see here the kind of rapid expanse that they've gone through in really what is only 18 months or so. Okay, so that gives us a little bit of background to all of this, and I won't bore you for too much longer. I just want to say a couple more things. So that tells us a little bit about the background of ISIS and how we've gotten to this point and where they've kind of come from and where their roots are. But I haven't really answered my own question, which is who are they? Let's just kind of summarise a couple of key things that we know about ISIS and what they've been doing over this period over the last couple of years. The first point that I'd like to make is that they're incredibly clever. My contention has been that since the events of September 11, 2001, the world has dramatically underestimated the intelligence of these terrorist networks. That they are far more sophisticated and far more intelligent and capable than we tend to assume. They're not sort of ragtag fundamentalist fools. They have a goal, they have an idea, they know what they're doing, and they're very clever at getting their results. They have been able to harness popular Sunni resentment, as I've said, against the regime in Syria and also the regime in Iraq. They draw their opponents, and this is what they've been doing with the Iraqi security forces, they draw the Iraqi security forces into complex asymmetric situations in which they know they will win. They will defeat the Iraqi security forces. In other words, it's a kind of ambush. And what they have done very cleverly is put the Iraqi security forces several times in a position where they have to go in to defend the civilians and, of course, lose in defending the civilians. And this dramatically undermines the Iraqi security forces in the eyes of the Sunni population and the Iraqi government in the eyes of the Sunni population, because if you can't defend citizens, then how can you be the credible army, right? So they're drawing them in. They're also capable of expanding and retreating when and if it suits their immediate agenda. So this idea of what they've done in the last 10 days by taking Mosul and holding it and so on is not actually what they've been doing for the bulk of their operations. Instead, what they've mostly been doing is moving in, capturing towns and cities, training and arming those people who will join them, and then rapidly retreating. And again, drawing in the Iraqi security forces, undermining them, defeating them, fighting back, disappearing again, and coming back in and disappearing again. So it's a very clever military strategy for such a small, amorphous kind of network. And of course, they've armed and trained various sleeper cells right across the region. In fact, the fall of Tikrit, we seem to know, it seems to now be the conventional wisdom, that the fall of Tikrit, especially, could not have happened if it weren't for the fact that there were very well-established sleeper cells already in that city, ready to go when ISIS gave them the word. Okay, that's one thing. They're incredibly clever. The second thing, they're incredibly cruel. And this is something we really need to be concerned about, in my view. They have an incredibly strict fundamentalist vision of Islam. We've been hearing the idea of an incredibly strict fundamentalist vision of Islam for more than a decade, but I think ISIS take it to a whole new level. In the territories that they've seized and captured, they have been setting up very strict Sharia law courts, and they have been publicly trying and executing anyone that they deem to be infidels, quote unquote, whether that be because you're not of Sunni Islam, so for example Christians. In fact, there's one account where a Christian was crucified in public and was on the cross, so to speak, for 18 hours, dying in one particular village in Syria. Now, we haven't seen crucifixions for 2,000 years, so this tells you the kind of remarkable cruelty that these guys will go to. Of course, there's been UN reports have come out now saying that women have been forced into marriage with members of ISIS and then raped. So it's an incredibly difficult situation, of course, for the women and children who are often forgotten in these terrible circumstances that are unfolding across the region. And other reports in the New York Times, you will have seen these mass graves that are now emerging in parts of Iraq that ISIS are taking. For example, into Crete, it's approximated, and of course these things are very difficult to verify in such a complex, ever-changing environment, but 1,700 people have been executed in a mass grave into Crete. And these are members of the former Iraqi security forces being executed by ISIS. So incredibly cruel, horrific stuff coming out. The final thing that I want to say is that ISIS are also incredibly well armed and incredibly well trained. In fact, you can go online and read ISIS annual reports over the last few years. They publish an annual report in which they document in detail, in detail their successes, their victories, how many rockets they've launched, how successful they were, how many people they've killed, and what their goals are for the forthcoming year. And they've been publishing these things for a number of years. So the idea that nobody knew ISIS was going to do anything like this is crazy. They've been out there publishing this stuff online for a number of years. A report in The Guardian estimated that their total cash and assets of ISIS amounts to $2.4 billion. So this is an incredibly well-heeled organisation. This doesn't include, if they were to establish a state, ISIS at this point controls several large oil fields and have aspirations to control it in Syria, and have aspirations to control additional oil fields in Iraq. If they were, and I'm not saying they will, but if they were to establish this Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, they would have billions of dollars worth of oil to sell. Whether or not anyone would buy it, I don't know, but that's an interesting thing to think about. And of course, their $2.4 billion that they have in cash and assets does not take into account the bankrolling of these groups. This week in The Independent, Robert Fisk, a well-known journalist, I'm sure most of you know of him, has come out saying that there's evidence, and I don't want to say that I've seen the evidence, but that there's evidence that Kuwait, Qatar and Saudi Arabia are bankrolling ISIS. And of course, the irony being that all three of these are key US allies in the region. So this is another massive problem that needs to be dealt with. As I said, I have days and days and days worth of material that I would love to go through and share with you all that I think would be very interesting and that I would greatly enjoy doing, but I'm going to leave it there, and I hope that we can deal with some of the other questions I raised at the outset in our discussion and through the presentations of my colleagues here. I hope that this has given some kind of context to you, and I hope that it stimulates a robust and engaging and challenging discussion that we can go into following all of this. Thanks to all of you for being here. I really appreciate it at such short notice. We only kind of came up with the idea of hosting this on Monday, so it's great so many people were able to show up on Thursday to be here. And I'm now going to hand over to James, who's going to tell us a little bit more about Iran and Iran's role in all of this moving forward.
Thank you, Ben. As Ben mentioned, I'll be talking about Iran and Iran's place in this matter. Now, I'm sure that you're familiar at a base level with some of the differences between Iran and Iraq. We've already talked about Sunni and Shia. Iran is a predominantly Shia country, but of course it's a particular type of Shiism. The language is different and the culture is to a large degree different, and that's one of the main issues when talking about Iran's influence in Iraq. It isn't absolute. There is a cultural difference, and that's something that you can't necessarily get over. I guess the immediate question is, that many people are asking, is will Iran send troops into Iraq? Iraq, the government of Baghdad is seen as an ally. Will Iran send in troops? And the only person who can constitutionally allow this is the supreme leader of the country, known as the Wali Faqih. His name is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He's the only person who can actually order troops to invade. Now, so what has he been saying? Very little. Beyond blaming Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United States for the very existence of ISIS, he hasn't said very much. Many other politicians and military leaders have had a lot more to say. And the reason is, this is traditional in Iranian politics, that even though the supreme leader is the head of state and the final word on many or most issues, he tries to keep a distance from the day-to-day politics of the state. In many ways, he's continuing the policy of his predecessor, Ayatollah Khomeini, who many of you would be familiar with. Now, so in order to better understand Iran's role in Iraq, I'm going to talk about how Iranian politicians, military leaders and the media have been responding to the situation of ISIS. Now, as always in Iran, the messages have been mixed, and this is representative both of the different factions within Iran, political factions vying for influence in the Islamic Republic, If you ever look at the Iranian political system, you will see it's highly complicated. There are several parliaments within the parliament, but also factions within these as well. And they're all competing. But also there is a habit of assimilation in the sense that people don't want to say too much in case they back the wrong side. Or people want to make statements which are very vague. Politicians, military leaders will make statements which are very vague, so they can't be accused of backing the wrong side or making the wrong decision. Now, the prospect of military collaboration with the United States is a perfect example of this, with President Rouhani saying that he would consider any approaches from the United States, while the Supreme National Security Council has stated quite clearly that they would never cooperate with the United States. Additionally, you have the newspaper. This all likelihood represents maybe the Supreme Leader's point of view, because the newspaper, which is closely aligned with his office, Kehan, has really put forward this idea that they don't want to cooperate with the Americans. Additionally, when John Kerry made his statement on Monday, that was front page news on Kehan, and they were almost ridiculing them in a sense that the United States is coming to beg Iran for help. So that gives you some idea about the sort of debates that are going on. But I won't say any more about this because Shahram will tell you more about the United States. Now, on the question of Iranians sending troops into Iraq, now some reports have already said that the Revolutionary Guards are already there. The Iranian media, of course, or the Iranian politicians and military have been denying this, but you can make what you want of it. Now, Iran has invaded Iraq before, part of the counteroffensive during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. So many Iranians have very bitter memories of that war. It's something that when I was there in 2010, most Iranians who were my age or older had very bitter memories of that war, and it was something that would be in the back of people's minds when they're thinking about troops going into Iraq. That would be something they would be thinking about. Now, the army has tightened its border controls and surveillance in Iran, and the President Rouhani has stated this week that Iran would confront ISIS inside Iraq if ISIS approached the Iranian border. Now, most political and military leaders in Iran have been saying the same thing. Iran will help Iraq if Iraq asks Iran to help Iraq. Now, few have clarified what this help means, though some, including the Interior Minister, on Monday, he said this would not involve sending in the military. Now, there are several reasons why Iran would be reluctant to send in the military. First is that it's not in a financial position to be involved in a prolonged war. There are sanctions on Iran, which have put the economy in a very desperate situation, and Iran is not going to invade without a very good reason of doing so. The second reason, of course, which I'll get to more in a moment, is Iran has its own way of dealing with issues like this in Iraq. There are people on the ground who are supportive of Iran, which Iran can facilitate in this sort of situation. Additionally, they don't want to be directly implicated in any sectarian revenge attacks, those that Ben was mentioning, or ethnic cleansing or any bloodbath that Ben was alluding to in the introduction. Finally, there's a realisation that anti-Iran sentiment is quite high in the region at the moment, and any invasion would inflame this. So anti-Iran sentiment is closely linked to anti-Shia sentiment that's accompanying the Syrian civil war and is quite widespread. Now, the Iranian government seems to be expecting the Shia population can protect itself without direct military intervention from Iran. They are counting on Shia Iraqis, some of whom are members of Iranian-backed groups, to protect Iraq or protect their parts of Iraq. This is why religious leaders both in Iran and Iraq have been calling for men to enlist over the past week. They understand, as Ben mentioned, that ISIS is going to encounter a different kind of opposition in Shia-dominated cities than what they've experienced in those that aren't Shia-dominated. As many Shias will no doubt feel they're not just fighting for their country, they're fighting for the very survival of themselves and their family. Now, Rouhani has also stated that any of the Shia holy sites, such as Samarra, which you can see in this map, Najaf, which is not there, Karbala, or Qazimane, which is in the Baghdad area, if they come under threat, Iran would invade Iraq, or Iran would come to protect these Shia holy sites. I don't want to go into too much detail of what the significance of these sites are, other than to say that they're not only just symbolic they're not only important to Shiism, they're symbolic of Shia identity to a large extent. Now, it's also hard to imagine Iran sending in troops, not sending in troops, whether overtly or covertly, if the governments of Baghdad or of the Kurdish region were threatened. This is because of not only both of these governments are friendly to Iran to a great extent, and there are numerous business interests in both areas. So it's not just a Shia-dominated government in Baghdad that Iran is friendly with, they're also friendly with the Kurdish government. In April this year, they signed an agreement to build a pipeline from the Kurdish north into Iran to help the Kurdish regions export their natural gases and oil. Now, a lot of this has been made of the Sunni-Shia divide, and I encourage the people not to think of these as absolute or ancient hatreds. Shia and Sunni have lived together in this region and indeed in other regions. They've cross-converted, they've cross-fertilised in their own beliefs, and intermarried, particularly over the past century. And it's only at critical junctures like this, where there is political competition, or competition for survival, where the differences seem ancient and impassable. It's important not to buy into ISIS propaganda either about Shias being loyal to Iran, as the ruling group in Baghdad, the Da'wah Party, does not ascribe to the same brand of political Shia ideology, which is the Velayat-e-Faqih, that the Iranians have. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. Not all Shia are the same, and not all Shia political groups follow the same ideology. The central point is that Iran's interests in Iraq are not solely Shia. It has close relations with the Kurdish government in the north, and this is evident in the fact that Prime Minister Barzani was in Iran this week talking with the Supreme National Security Council about the situation in Iraq. The other main concerns, of course, would be security that Iran would have, would be security for the many Iranian citizens who live in Iraq, who are there for business reasons, who are studying or work or acting as pilgrims or live as pilgrims in Iraq. In the meantime, Iran is trying to fight the propaganda war, both at home and abroad. First, they want to discredit ISIS, which is known in Iran by its Arabic acronym Daesh. They want to discredit as neither Muslim or indigenous to the region. One of the key ways they're doing this is by using the term Takfiri to describe ISIS, as well as other militants associated with Salafi and Wahhabi beliefs. And this can be extended to Saudi Arabia, though they don't explicitly do this. Now, the term Takfiri, I'm not going to explain it in too much detail other than to say one way it's being used is to represent the people, but just to mean that these people are not representing Islam, and rather they are at war with Islam. And so the message is, it is not unlawful to resist them or fight them. In addition to not being Muslim or properly Muslim, ISIS is labelled as foreign. So as I mentioned before, the United States is being blamed. NATO, which is a veiled reference towards Turkey, is also blamed. Saudi Arabia, who are called the Wahhabis, they are blamed. Qatar, known as the oligarchy or the oligarchs, they have been blamed. And they've noted the support that these countries have had for anti-Assad movements in Syria, which is essentially where ISIS has got a lot of its momentum from. In addition, of course, the chief of staff of the armed forces and some media commentators have blamed Israel, but this is fairly routine in a situation like this. Now, these examples are used as a defence in some ways for not invading Iraq, which many Iranians, though not all Iranians, would want their government to do, particularly Shia shrines were under threat. In response to this, representatives of the government, such as the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Marzieh Afghani, they are saying that foreign intervention is actually the cause of the problem and not the solution. That it's people from the United States, from Qatar and Saudi Arabia interfering in Iraq which have caused this problem, and invading Iraq is not going to solve this problem. More importantly, blaming outsiders removes Iran's Politburo from having any responsibility, but also will be used to explain the situation continuing on. So if there is a conspiracy, there's not much Iran can do other than battle the conspiracy, but people are still actively working against Iraq. So this is if this issue continues, or this situation continues for a long period of time. Furthermore, some Iranian politicians and media commentators have been critical of Maliki, the ruler of Iraq, the president of Iraq, Prime Minister of Iraq, but not in the same way as Western media. So Kayhan, which I mentioned above, stated that Maliki was guilty not for fostering sectarian tensions, as what has been reported in Western media, but for not giving the people of Mosul, so Shia, Sunni and Kurdish people alike, a reason to stand and fight, by allowing corrupt politicians to destroy unity in the country. Others have stated that Maliki bears responsibility for not organising his government sooner after the elections, which happened recently, which has allowed ISIS to seize an opportunity. So to conclude, what I would say is Iran would feel encircled, would feel in a very difficult situation if they lost their supporters in Baghdad and in Erbil in the Kurdish regions. So Iranian leaders, it's important to note, are not uniform in their approaches to this situation, and this complicates the ability for any of the arms of government to act on it. However, none are indicating that they want to send troops into Iraq because they cannot afford it, they do not want to be blamed for any bloodshed, and they do not want to be accused of claiming sectarian tensions. At present, Iran mainly wants to win the propaganda war at home and in the region, and they wouldn't be upset with the US helping Iraq, I wouldn't think, though Shahram will talk more about this, mainly because it would contribute to the idea of Western intervention in the region causing problems. But essentially, those are the points that I want to make. And I'll move on to now to David, who is going to talk a little bit about Iraq's other neighbour, Turkey, and the situation and their approach towards Iraq. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I'm going to briefly talk about Turkey, both in the immediate and slightly longer term. In particular, I'm going to try and focus on two issues. As I said, there's a lot that one can go into, so I'm trying to limit myself. And namely, that's the present hostage situation in Mosul, and the longer-term issue of the potential that Ben pointed to, which is the parceling up of Iraq and what that means for Turkey, particularly in relation to the Kurds and their own peace process. So I'll begin with just talking about the immediate short-term issue, which is the hostage crisis, and how they're responding to that. So for those who don't know, on the 11th of June, ISIS stormed the Turkish consulate in Mosul and have taken 49 staff, including the Consul General, as well as 31 truck drivers hostage. And there have been a lot of really strange mixed messages about this turn of events, with reportedly members of ISIS saying that they're not actually being held hostage, they're actually being held for their own protection. There's been some of the other ISIS people say no, they are hostages. There's been reports in the Turkish media that the truck drivers have been ransomed for $5 million. So it's a bit confusing, and there's been a media ban in Turkey, and I'll get to that a bit later. So it's been hard to find out what's actually the truth of the matter in terms of why they've been taken. One of the theories as to why the consulate has been stormed and they've taken hostages is that Turkey was actually helping pump up the numbers for ISIS by freely allowing the militants to cross the border and Turkey into Syria during the civil conflict there, with the hope of actually toppling the Assad regime. So they've actually for a long time been supporting it, and recently there's been a clampdown by the Turkish government on preventing people from crossing the border. So this could be seen as retaliation against the Turks for actually stopping their supply. And previously also the Turkish government had actually been seen to injured fighters as well. So that's one possible theory as to why this has happened. And but beyond that, as I said, there's been a blackout on the media, so we don't really have any clearer views. And for the moment, it seems fairly clear that the Turks are not interested in pursuing military intervention on account of this turn of events with the 80 hostages being taken. Presently, they've opted for a negotiated solution and are seeking to mobilise international support. And Erdogan recently is reported to have spoken to Vice President Joe Biden and requested that no military action be taken at this point. And this has also been asked of the neighbouring countries, namely Iraq and Iran, not to actually do anything in relation to that situation, as they don't want to jeopardise the safety of those who have been taken hostage. And actually, I should mention also the Turkish government, in a peculiar approach, has also said they're not hostages. I don't know how they came to that reasoning, but that's one of the messages coming out of the Turkish government. And so what they're doing at the moment is they're trying to manage the situation by, as I said, having issued a ban. So no media outlets in Turkey at the moment are allowed to report on the situation for fear of inflaming it. There's been an appeal by the opposition parties to try and overturn this ban. So we'll have to watch that space and see whether anything changes there. But the opposition, I feel like they're unlikely to be able to get it overturned. And so, as I said, there's really a dearth of information. At the moment, what they're doing is they're going through back channels. They're trying to negotiate with local tribes to try and orchestrate a release of the hostages. And as I said, it's looking unlikely at this immediate term that there's any chance of a special forces type operation like we've seen before in other circumstances, like America doing with the compound in Pakistan, try and release people or kill people. But David Olu, the foreign minister, has made some fairly strong statements indicating that if things do go sour, that things could go to a military action pretty quickly by stating that no one should try and test the limits of Turkey's strength, and any harm to our citizens and staff will be met with the harshest retaliation, which, as I said, suggests that, you know, in certain circumstances, military intervention is not potentially far away. And in a current blow to these negotiations, just within the last 24 hours, and Ben mentioned this before, Tikrit has been taken, and as a result of this, more Turkish hostages have been taken. So now they've got 2 crisis points, one in Tikrit and one in Mosul, with out of about, I think, 60 construction workers that were taken out of the 100. Some locals were allowed to were let go. There's 15 now construction workers which are also taken as they were fleeing from Tikrit to the Kurdish town of Sulaymaniyah. So in the immediate term, Turkey's got its hands full with trying to actually get its citizens out of Iraq safely, and with a lot of the domestic political issues going on with the mine collapse and the corruption scandals, they can't afford to have anything really go against them, particularly with for Erdogan, who's yet to announce whether he's going to go for the presidential election, but they don't want to lose any political capital, so they're really playing it low-key at the moment. So that's the current immediate situation. With regards to the broader implications, the present conflict has serious role to play in the Kurdish peace process. For the last few years, behind the scenes, the Turkish government has been trying to actually negotiate with the PKK and come to a peace arrangement. This has been stewarded by the National Intelligence Organization headed by Hakan Fidan, who's one of the right-hand men of Erdogan. And of course, this has actually caused ructions in Turkey itself. There's, as I said, there's currently a scandal with the Gülen movement, who have brought a case, or tried to bring a case against Hakan Fidan, who are actually against brokering with the PKK. So this whole peace process has serious domestic implications as well. So there's internal power plays going on there. And so now, with the taking of Kirkuk, this complicates the situation even further. Because now the Peshmerga, who have filled the vacuum from the lack of Iraqi forces who are able to defend the area, they're possibly in waiting now to sort of move for independence. And because for a long time the Kurds who control the northern part of Iraq, as we've heard, have really felt that perhaps Kirkuk is the missing part of the independence puzzle, and it's in some circles referred to as the Kurdish Jerusalem. And they've actually laid a claim to this as it being going all the way back to the 18th century, apparently to the claims of the Babur clan. And so, having gained control, this is now people are asking the question: are they really working to help support the Iraqi security forces which are there, or is this really now just a case of moving towards trying to set up an independent state? And the predominant view, along many of the pundits, is that the Kurds really are now simply just biding their time, and that they're waiting to reap rewards of the possible disintegration and the parceling up of Iraq, and they want to avoid, at this stage, any direct military conflict with Iraq, Turkey or Iran. And presently this is due to the possibility that ISIS might actually try to set up its own sort of semi-autonomous territory. And this is looking quite a possibility. I was unaware, actually, as Ben pointed out, they have a total value now of 2.9 billion, which is quite staggering. Because as they took Mosul, they've now got the oil refinery, which actually provides all of the domestic oil. So that actually puts them in quite a strong position in the sense of actually being able to cut off supply to the rest of Iraq, which is problematic. And also, when they took Mosul, they also raided the bank. And so I suppose when Ben was referring to the 2.9 billion, if we look at the detail, they actually netted $450 million in that raid, which has actually, that alone, above and beyond the net value, probably taking the refineries, because they took Beji as well, which is another oil refinery town. That was, so they really now have incredible capacity to purchase more weapons, alongside the stuff that they've already taken from the Iraqi forces, such as the Humvees, which they've driven through the border that Ben was talking about, which have been broken down. So this provides a serious quandary for the incumbent AKP, both on the domestic front as well as more broadly, because, again, there's opposition to dealing with the PKK as it is at home, and now it's looking like they might actually have to deal with the possibility of an independent Kurdish state, which for their 13.4 million Kurds in Turkey raises some issues. So, and adding to the complexity of all of this is the fact that Turkey's kind of almost burning their own bridges in a way, in the sense that they've been underwriting the movement of oil for the Kurds. Since having taken over the city of Kirkuk, they've actually helped store at the port of Ceyhan a lot of their oil, and helping them seek a buyer has actually really upset the Iraqi government, Maliki, and they've been told off. And I think they're actually looking to take legal action against Turkey. So that's another development which is taking place at the moment. But I think this was done probably without the understanding that Kirkuk would be taken, and that with the possibility of moving towards an independent state, which would perhaps raise the irredentist tendencies of the Kurdish population in the east of Turkey. And illustrative of this problem is it's been reported that PKK members and other group members have actually been crossing over to bolster the forces to help maintain those territories which have now been taken, the extended territories which have been taken by the Kurdish, the Peshmerga. And so it looks like there is the possibility of some sort of synergy taking place between the Kurdish groups in Turkey and those in Iraq. So yeah, Turkey in effect is caught in a rock and a hard place in between having had good relations with the Kurdish autonomous region, but now facing the possibility of an independent Kurdistan and what that means for their peace process, which we've been working on for a number of years. So those are the two issues that I really wanted to raise at the moment. That Turkey is really, because of the immediate hostage crisis, can't really engage militarily for fear of what that will do and the political capital in terms of what it affects on the domestic position, and of course for the longer term, that now they're really facing a protracted problem with the Kurdish issue, because the peace process will most likely have to be put on hold. And I'll leave it there. I'll pass now over to Sharon to sum up the situation and add the American angle. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you, David. Great to be here. I'm the lucky last. That means all the important points are already covered by my colleagues. So I have the privilege of, I get the easy job. I can just sum up and also allow an opportunity for question and answers, because we conceived this workshop, this session, to be an interactive one, and I'm mindful that we may be running out of time, so I want to make sure there is enough time for question and answer, and your feedback as well. We'd love to hear what you think about the evolving crisis in Iraq. But a couple of things, very quickly, very quickly, I won't take too much time. We talked about the American position, and we talked about other regional neighbors of Iraq. I want to look at possibly where can we go from here. There has been a crisis, there are historical reasons for the crisis, but where can we go from here? What's the solution? What are the alternatives? Everyone's looking to the United States as the state, as the power that can salvage this mess. But we know that President Obama has no desire to send boots on the ground. Obama came to office with a message of withdrawing from Middle East conflicts. This was very much his mandate, his objective. He's followed through. He's pulled troops out of Iraq, and he is following through in Afghanistan. So what can Obama do now that he has put himself in that box? Some say that he has still the option of sending drones to target ISIS. Drones have limited capability, limited benefits. They might damage some bases, they might damage some fighting forces, but drones cannot win territory for the Iraqi army. It's the Iraqi army that really needs to make the real effort and get their act together and push ISIS back. There is talk that the Iraqi army might benefit from reinforcing troops from Iran. You hear that? Early on, there's so much media speculation that Iran is sending troops. I wouldn't be surprised that there are currently Iranian troops, specialized troops in Iraq at the moment. The Revolutionary Guard, the religious army in Iran, has a commitment to making sure that ISIS does not succeed a lot more seriously than what the government might say or might not say. And here is a problem. When Saddam Hussein fell, when the United States went in and implemented regime change, a lot of other Arab neighbors were critical of the United States, saying that the United States is in fact opening the way for a Shia revival. And then they pointed to the rise of the Shia assertiveness in Iraq and the marginalization of the Sunnis in Iraq as evidence that, in fact, and of course, close relationship between the Iraqi government and Iran, as evidence that the United States is in fact working for Iran. You might think this is a bit outlandish, but just imagine if now we discover that Iran is effectively helping the Iraqi army in pushing ISIS out. Then that is really further proof for anyone who's thinking along those lines that the United States and Iran are in cahoots. And there's, of course, more evidence. I mean, if you want to think from that perspective, there's more evidence. The nuclear discussions between Iran and the United States and the prospects of rapprochement will give further justification for that argument that the United States is not really interested in its other allies in the region, other Arab allies, but more focused in repairing relations with Iran. So this is a problem. It's a serious problem because it reinforces and re-entrenches that sectarian divide, and it puts the United States on the part of the Shia and puts the Sunni community as in opposition to the Shia. It reinforces sectarian mentality. And I think, in my point of view, it's very important for the United States, very important for the Iraqi government, and very important for the Iranian government to ensure that Saudi Arabia is involved in any negotiation towards the resolution of this crisis in Iraq. And of course, it's easier said than done. Very obvious, easier said than done, because you know Saudi Arabia, in terms of theological thinking, in terms of religious instructions, Shia is not accepted as a legitimate and acceptable part of Islam. In fact, there was a lot of fatwa issued by Saudi scholars, Wahhabi scholars, encouraging Saudi citizens to go off to Syria and engage in jihad. So they use the term jihad to fight against the Alawites in Syria. So they realized this is going to come back and bite them in the end, because a lot of the Saudi nationals who have gone to Syria can easily come back to Saudi Arabia and then point the finger at the Saudi kingdom as not being truly Islamic enough, according to that strict interpretation of Islam that they will be following. So Saudi Arabia is at a very critical juncture, in my point of view. For its own sake and for its own stability, it needs to find a diplomatic solution, and it needs to work with Iran, and it needs to work with the United States in stopping the advance of ISIS, not just militarily, but intellectually, conceptually, religiously. There needs to be that degree of religious engagement with the community in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere that ISIS is not really representing Islam. I think I'm going to stop because we have heard so much here, and open the floor to questions and comments. And as I mentioned, we really welcome your insight into Iraq and the crisis. We have a roving mic for questions. You're so advanced. And we have here. Cool. Sure.
or say who I am or
Why
something.
don't you do that, please?
Hello, I'm Luke Howard from Monash and Global Terrorism Research Centre. Back in the early days of media reporting of this issue is that they're trying to frame it as an extension of the terror war, or this is to Al-Qaeda, this is how you can relate it to media audiences. But there's nothing that I've heard today that would suggest there's any sort of terrorist element to this. It's civil war, guerrilla fighting or insurgency, but that doesn't even really apply because they're actually a powerful apparatus capable of themselves to challenge other powerful apparatuses of the state or whatever. How important is that distinction going to be as this continues to be a media issue in Australia and begins to overlap with things like Australians and New Zealanders going to Syria to join various ranks? How do you see this playing out over the next maybe 4 to 6 weeks?
If I may just reflect on that, I think there is a clear terrorism dimension to it. It is very true that this is a civil war scenario, but it's a civil war where one body, one fighting group, is drawing from expatriate Muslims traveling from outside the region, whether it's Saudi Arabia. Today in the paper there was a report of an Australian Muslim being involved on the part of ISIS. We know that the problem of foreign fighters has been a big issue in Syria, and now that problem is moving to Iraq. So the end result is you have a number of highly trained, battle-hardened jihadists who would go back to their country of origin and pose security threats to the country of origin. I mean, that is the most obvious connection I can think of. I don't know if my colleagues want to add to this. Or perhaps we go to the next question. Maybe quite a few questions.
Hello, my name is Ahmed. I'm from Spectrum Research Centre. I just want to go back 2 weeks ago to the incident itself. I would like to say that the capture of Mosul, from my point of view, does not in any way reflect the capacity or the capability of ISIS to capture a city in the size of Mosul. And if you bear with me, I will show my evidence. 6 or 7 months ago, and as a result of the exacerbated pressure on the Iraqi government, the Central Iraqi government, that was some negotiated in the USA during Maliki visit to Washington, that some concessions to be given to the Sunni provinces that's governed by the Sunni to withdraw the national Iraqi from these cities and let the locals themselves provide protection. And what I think that it was a betrayal has been orchestrated by Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and actioned by the governor of Mosul himself, and evidence that as soon as Mosul was captured, he fled to Erbil. He should have been flown to Iraq, to Baghdad, to seek assistance or support. Erbil itself, Masoud al-Barzani did not issue any statement outlining the risk or saying what has to be done next, and actually in the opposite, they go and capture Kirkuk. So what I think it's orchestrated away before that date, and I thought I should stop.
Okay, we can get a comment. Thank you. There's a question, 2 questions at the front.
I'm interested in it, and then we can comment from there.
Perhaps, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sharon's right in saying that that's a comment, and it's a comment I very much take on board. I think in the coming days and weeks we will learn so much about what has occurred in places like Mosul, Kirkuk, Tikrit, and the story will be much bigger than the story we've gotten via the global media in the last couple of weeks.
You're already talking about underestimating the role of the army, the national army itself.
Yeah, and I have seen evidence of what you're talking about, and I think that there is something to be said for that. I mean, there's a lot of conflicting stories here. So one of the big conflicting stories is that the fall of Tikrit was a kind of inside Ba'athist job, and the Naqshbandi group, the former Ba'athist loyalists, actually orchestrated this completely. They were all ready to go weeks in advance, and it was all kind of preordained that this was more or less going to happen. I don't disagree with what you said. I think it's going to take over the next few weeks and even months for us to collect all of the evidence about the relationships between ISIS and former Ba'athist groups, Sunni militias and tribesmen, and also the role of the Iraqi security forces and the fact that they have pulled out, and that there's much more to the story than them simply sort of being cowards as they're being portrayed and dropping their weapons and running at the last minute. But how much more to the story and the extent to which it's been orchestrated is something that that only time will reveal as we get more and more information. But I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think there's probably a lot more to the whole story that we know yet. Yeah.
So I just would like two-part question. So is ISIS a cohesive group? Do we know who runs ISIS? Is there a group of people running it, one person? Are they racially, together, homogenous? What sort of group is it? And also, having asked that, what is their aim? Are they looking for sort of global dominance within Islamic State, or is it just local Syria, Iraq as a caliphate? I'd just like to know. Thank you.
I'll just have a go and then I'd like you to comment on it too. It's interesting that ISIS's flag says the Islamic State of Iraq and Shams. So geographically, they are contained. They don't conceive of their mission as expansive. But having said that, the whole idea of caliphate is an expansive concept. As long as you have a Muslim population living in a territory, it belongs to the caliphate. It should not be left out of it. So there is a certain ambiguity in the geographical demarcation of ISIS and their vision, in my point of view. Also, going back to the question of whether they are ethnically, racially homogeneous, certainly not. You have people volunteering from all walks of life, effectively. Any jihadi who can be radicalized online or through other literature can join ISIS. So you can be British, you can be Australian, you can be from Saudi Arabia. So that's ethnicity is no barrier, and of course that is very much true. That's remaining true to the whole notion of the ummah. Ummah is transnational. It's not constrained and contained by ethnic or religious demarcation. Ben, please.
Well, I think, again, Sharon's summarised it very well. There is a leader, Baghdadis, who is the kind of second protege of a guy called Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who ran al-Qaeda in Iraq back in 2006 and achieved a lot of notoriety. Baghdadis is, in the day and age in which we live of media and exposure and Facebook and Twitter and something, there is actually only one photo that anybody seems to be able to dig out of Baghdadis. So he is a remarkably shadowy figure. We don't know much about him. We don't know really, there's various conflicting reports about where he's from and what his life story is, and what his leadership style is like. I guess what he's observed, probably quite wisely, is that Zarqawi was such a big figure. He was so proud to film himself holding machine guns and mowing people down, and he was so proud to be on TV. Osama bin Laden was the same, and so on, always doing these voice recordings that were publicly, given out and so on. And I think he's very cleverly worked out that his strength is being a kind of enigma. And that's exactly what he is. So we really don't know much about him. I agree with Sharon absolutely. As long as you're a Sunni fundamentalist jihadist, you are welcome. It doesn't matter the colour of your skin. In fact, if you look at the photos coming out of ISIS, you'll see that there are some very white, we know one Australian Muslims involved, but there are some very quote-unquote white guys involved in ISIS. So they're transnational. There are people flooding in from all over the world to be part of this movement. It was once called ISI, Islamic State in Iraq. Now it's called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Tomorrow it may well be called Islamic State in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, so on and so on. So if they are able to continue to grow and if they are able to continue to enhance their capacity, their vision is of one united Ummah under a caliphate. My doubts are very large that they're ever going to be able to do that. I think their capacity to do what I would call governance, actually run a place, is remarkably small. They simply don't have the capacity to do things like waste disposal or set up hospitals or schools or any of these kind of normal functioning. They've set up these kind of quasi-courts where they do sort of Sharia law and execute people and all this kind of stuff. This is very kangaroo, on-the-run kind of mechanisms. It's not stuff that's real. It's not state building. Their capacity is very small to set up a functioning state. More to the point, they are that cruel and that extreme that I just don't see the Sunni population in Iraq, who we should remember have a very proud secular tradition and history. They're the foundation of the Ba'ath Party, who were in their initial, of course they turned into a horrible movement, but in their initial impetus were a secular sort of pan-Arab ideology. This secular trend and these secular ideas and inclusive ideas of a vast majority of the Sunni population, or a big proportion of the Sunni population, I just don't think will like this aggressive, strict interpretation of Sharia law.
So we've got a question here and then these two gentlemen.
Please.
I'm Kerry Nadeed from the Australian Iraqi Forum. About the leadership of the group, the current leader is Ibrahim Ali al-Badri. He is Iraqi national and he is an ex-army general in the Southern Army. He is from Anbar and he is very, very well known. He is the current leader of ISIS.
Thank you. A couple of questions. So, in the original talks, you were just talking about advances by ISIS, whereas some reports in the media have said that it's not just ISIS, it's various tribal groups and also Ba'ath Party people. So just the relative weight of those forces. Secondly, it said that the Maliki government has alienated the Sunni population. So what sort of grievances do they have, and are those grievances justified? Thirdly, Ghetto was quoted, sort of Robert Fisker, saying that they were getting aid from Saudi Arabia and the other states as well. Is this from the governments of those countries or from opposition forces within those countries, or where is the aid coming from?
I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. Issahan, to respond.
And we should definitely have a question aimed at some of the broader regional implications, as important as everything going on in Iraq is, and I think we do need to address that because it's really substantive. We should definitely engage with some of the ideas about Iran and Turkey and the US and so on, because they're going to play a really critical role in what happens next, as Sharon was articulating there. Okay, your three questions get three answers. Is it just ISIS? Absolutely not. In fact, as someone said, the global media loves kind of this simplicity. Let's just reduce it down to ISIS. In fact, they're routinely just called sort of Al-Qaeda in Iraq or Al-Qaeda subsidiary ISIS or whatever, because this resonates with a kind of decade or more than a decade of talking about Al-Qaeda, talking about these groups. What we have is a much more complicated scenario than that. We have a number of different Sunni tribal groups who do not all see eye to eye, although there are some alliances, ever-shifting alliances between them. We also have Naqshbandi, which I talked about a moment ago, which is a kind of subsidiary of the Ba'ath Party, that again, through the fog of everything that's happened in the last 10 days, it's very difficult to estimate the accuracy of everything that we're hearing, but especially in Tikrit, it's understood that they have played an active role in what's going on. And we also have a number of other sort of what might be called Sunni militias or terrorist groups or fighting entities that are not necessarily aligned to one or the other. At the moment, what we've seen really is a relationship of convenience. What the Sunnis share in most parts of Iraq are this goes to your second part of your question, are very significant grievances with the Shia Arab-dominated government in Baghdad. What are these grievances? It's a long and sordid tale, and one we probably don't have a great deal of time to go into today, and it's a complex story that really goes back to the fact that the Sunnis, which are 20% of the population, dominated Iraq from 1921 onwards, and were the kind of elites in many senses. Their parts of Iraq were very wealthy and very well established and very well to do and so on. With the fall of Saddam, 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 the fall of Saddam,